thank you to Knight for joining us for this lecture. Our next lecture in March will be Sean Levy, who some of you know. She's a local historian, and she will talk on prohibition in Los Alamos. And there'll be some interesting little door prizes, I think, that evening. So I hope you'll join us. It should be a fun one. Tonight, the lecture series is brought to you, made possible by the generous sponsorship of Enterprise Bank and Trust, and a special grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the New Mexico Humanities Council, and also special thanks to Robin and Richard McLean, who helped sponsor this year's lecture series. Tonight, we have Rebecca Ullrich here. She's the corporate historian for Sandia National Laboratories and is a distinguished member of the laboratory staff. Ullrich is a historian of science trained at Reed College and the University of California, Berkeley. Her particular area of interest is government-funded research and development. Within Sandia, she provides support for internal projects on various topics, develops content for the history website, and provides historic building assessments and documentation of historic properties. So she should come visit the Oppenheimer house. Her recent research includes interviews and documentation for a video on the history of nuclear waste management and a presentation on the key impact of women at Sandia. She's currently working on a history of the earth sciences at Sandia. So we are really excited tonight to have Rebecca Ullrich with us, see how they spun off from the Manhattan Project. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Liz, for the nice introduction and for sponsoring this lecture series, or for putting together this lecture series. It's very exciting. I'm anxious to learn about prohibition in Los Alamos. And thank you to Amy Slaughter for inviting me to participate today. And thank you for hosting me in your online lecture theater. Thanks to all of you for allowing me some of your time tonight. I hope not to disappoint. I'm going to tell you about the origins of Sandia National Laboratories, one of the U.S. Department of Energy, National Nuclear Security Administration labs. Sandia is a multi-mission national security laboratory, which just means that it started in nuclear weapons and has moved out into other areas of national security. It currently has a workforce of about 14,000 people. It has a main site in Albuquerque and a second lab site in Livermore, California, as well as test ranges in Tonopah, Nevada, and Kauai, Hawaii. It's a large research and development laboratory now, but like most things, it started small, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So it's timely. This was a picture of Oppenheimer, not in his house there. Sandia traces its roots to Z Division of Los Alamos, which started during World War II when Los Alamos was part of the Manhattan Engineer District. That is the Manhattan Project as we know it colloquially. Z Division was formed in July of 1945. It was part of a broader reorganization within Los Alamos. If you're associated with any kind of institution, you know that they are forever reorganizing, trying to get the org chart right. Z Division was established as part of the effort to prepare for the continuation of weapons development and production in the post-war period. Basically, we can imagine Robert Oppenheimer and General Groves looking out past the wartime effort. If we think about what's going on in July of 1945, the war in Europe was over. The war in the Pacific is looking like it'll go to the Allies. The Allies are fairly confident, although it's not at all clear when and how that's going to happen. Robert Oppenheimer has the little boy gun type design in place with a fair amount of confidence in it, and they're getting ready to test the Fat Man implosion type design at Trinity. So July 1945. And in the reorganization, they gathered up the ordnance engineering elements at Los Alamos into one engineering group, including the test functions then located at Wendover, Utah, conducting test drops preparatory to use of the weapons. And they're really looking to improve and expand these functions. They're also looking to move an element of the Los Alamos activity off of the hill because it was very crowded. crowded up there, and the lack of utilities, especially water, was a pressure point. Both Oppenheimer and General Groves stressed that there was no room to expand any function at Los Alamos at that point in time. The Z Division functions also needed to be near an airfield, but preferably closer to Los Alamos than Wendover in Utah. And the Z Division functions would include working closely with the military to ensure a smooth handoff of the atomic devices and nuclear weapons to the military. Z Division was placed under Gerald Zacharias. You see him there on the left. He had worked on radar at MIT during the war and then joined Los Alamos just in 1945. And he returned to MIT shortly after the war's end. He was noted for molecular beam research and also played a large role in science education in this post-Sputnik world. But for our story, he's really just going to come and go on this slide. Z Division included design activities, experimental systems engineering, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering for production, and electronic engineering, design of the non-nuclear components for nuclear weapons. Okay, so that's their core piece. Field test, which was environmental and developmental testing, and the support of nuclear testing. So all those functions came into Z Division. Assembly, and that was to include an assembly factory and procurement capability, including weapon assembly for the non-nuclear portion of the nuclear weapons. And then finally, military liaison, as I mentioned, working with the military to hand off the weapons, to hand off deliverable, usable weapons. Overall, Z Division was responsible for turning the physics package created by Los Alamos and later Lawrence Livermore National Lab into a deliverable weapon, turning it into military ordnance, and that's known as weaponization at the time. And they referred to it that as years, that they were weaponeers and they were doing weaponization. So they're creating weapons. And their initial purpose, their initial mission, their initial assignment was to advance the engineering and support testing of nuclear weapon designs, particularly Fat Man, which you see there, the model of Fat Man there in the back, little boy there in the front. And so the idea was that they already had the Fat Man design, but they're going to move forward and try to improve that design. The ballistics of the weapon in particular left a lot of room for improvement. And they were also to provide production engineering for weapon components, and at this early point to produce and assemble weapons. So in other words, to improve the design and then to build more of them and assemble them. So they go looking for a place. If they're not going to be up in Los Alamos, where are they going to be? So they go out on a site selection tour with criteria of they'd like to be near the military, they'd like to be near an airfield, and they would like to not be too far from Los Alamos itself. They chose the area of the old Oxnard Field on the outskirts of Albuquerque, beyond the city limits to the southeast. The Oxnard Field served as a private airfield in Albuquerque and opened for traffic in 1928. And it was Albuquerque's first airport. And then in the 1930s, the Albuquerque Municipal Airport was established further to the west, up near where the current airport is located. That happened in the 1930s, but they selected this site, the old Oxnard Field, to place Z Division. And by World War II, this is basically what they look like. That big X in the back is the old Oxnard Field that you can see back there. That big, the big. You can see their flight lines there. The runways out there still marking that big X in the ground. And we are in this photo from July of 1945. We're looking out towards Tejeras Canyon along the left side of the photo on the top left. That little streak along the left, that's Central or Route 66. And there's no Interstate 40, which will go through that area eventually, but we're about a decade out from the Interstate Highway Act, but when this photo is taken, so there's no interstate. And there's all those nice hotels along Central there, that along Route 66. And in the foreground, or the middle, really the middle part of the photo here, is what was Kirtland Army Airfield by this point in the war. And in the back was Albuquerque Army Airfield in the back. So there were two Army airfields here during the war. Land had been taken during the war for the Army, for their what will be the Air Forces. And the current Albuquerque Airport is actually just in front of us and down below on the ground, obviously. But we're sort of suspended with an aerial photograph, so we're suspended behind it here to the west, and we're looking east. Excuse me. And they're going to put Z Division down here by the Oxnard Field, in the back here in the little cluster of buildings. They're just to the left or to the north of the big X from the old Oxnard Airfield. And over time, all of this is going to, of course, Albuquerque is going to grow out here to the edges of the base. And these two bases are going to merge in 1971 into Kirtland Air Force Base, but until then they remain separate. And in the back there, where they're going to put Z Division, the Army Air Force's Convalescent Center had been established in mid-1944. And off to the south, to the right of the photo, past the edge of the photo, E.J. Workman, a physicist at UNM, had conducted testing for the proximity fuse effort during the war. So the proximity fuse was developed, and the research was done out at Johns Hopkins in Maryland, but the testing was done out here on the south end of what is now Kirtland Air Force Base. So that land was basically, all this land was taken for the wartime effort, taken out of private hands and into government service. And that transition to take that site in the back and give it to the Manhattan Project occurs right in the middle of July 1945. On July 14th, the Corps of Engineers requested the transfer of the jurisdiction for Albuquerque Army Airfield. And then, of course, 2 days later was the Trinity test. So it's not like Oppenheimer didn't have a lot on his mind. And then July 21st, the field was actually transferred from the jurisdiction of the Air Technical Service Command to the U.S. Engineers Manhattan District. And the transfer included Albuquerque Army Airfield, the airbase, and all of its leased facilities. So it's basically it remains military, it just shifts to the different part of the Army. And after that, the part in the back there, the land that they had just transferred, was referred to as Sandia Base. And as we look at Sandia Base, now we're looking, there's that big X of Oxnard Airfield to orient us. We're now looking basically roughly north with the Sandia Mountains off there to the right, in the top right of the photo. And Z Division is going to settle in the very middle part of this. This is going to be what becomes Tech Area 1 at Sandia. Sandia, it still is Tech Area 1. If you've been on the base and you're familiar with it, the stripe cutting across just below where the buildings are, just above the X, that basically is where Hardin Avenue is now. Okay, so if you're familiar with the area, that means something. If not, it's just what will become a road. And I'll just point out that all the little dots scattered around this that are lined up in neat rows, those are all aircraft. And they're aircraft that are being brought back from the war, at the end of the war. And there's a large salvage operation going on in this area to recover all of the metal and all the scrap. They chop up the aircraft and turn them into scrap metal, and then haul it all away. So at the war's end, so all this retired aircraft around there, with then what is going to become Sandia Labs, Sandia National Labs eventually, right there in the middle. Okay. So Z Division began moving down to this space in September of 1945. Not everyone moved at once. It would be early in 1947 before the whole division was moved. And part of that was just a lack of space, lack of buildings on within the base for them to move to. So they had to build up the space so that they could move people to it. And I just want to mention, because I find this photograph so striking. If you think about Albuquerque right now, we're looking north from the base. So, and this is what is the road that's you can see going up the center of the base and then on out to the north. That's Wyoming. All right, and then it intersects with Central. So all of this land up there to the north that looks so beautiful and empty and lovely is now the Northeast Heights. Okay, this is all filled in. All of this is filled in with human construction, all around and all around to the also to the east there, right down to the Eubank, what is now the Eubank Gate. So I just want to emphasize that. But when Z Division was moving down here, this is what it looked like. The first groups to arrive were procurement and the storage activities and field test. And field test is going to take advantage of that land to the south ultimately and build environmental test facilities where the proximity fused research was done. Of course, you want procurement to be here because you're trying to build up a site. So you need somebody to write the checks. Part of the reason for the slow transition was the lack of resources at the site. As I mentioned, the building, there wasn't space, and they were also doing hiring, and it was all happening as quickly as possible. But in the immediate transition out of World War II into the peace, there was a very large demobilization. Both military personnel and individuals who had worked for the Manhattan Project as civilians were heading home as soon as possible. There were also ongoing personnel changes and leadership transitions within Z Division in the first 2 years. In October of 1945, Norris Bradbury announced that Gerald Zacharias was leaving. Roger S. Warner would be acting division leader for Z Division. And Bradbury himself, of course, was in transition to become Los Alamos director as Oppenheimer left. So this is part of the, this is what if closer in on the site. This is the north edge of Tech Area 2 that we're looking at, just south of the base chapel. So we're looking sort of northwest here out of the area. And the base chapel, which is easy to see because of course it has a steeple. There's construction going on just to the south of it. You can see this is from a February of 1946 aerial of the area, and there's construction going on there. That is building 828 going up, and it was the one of the first buildings built specifically for Z Division's activities. That is where they weren't just moving into existing buildings, and it was a mechanical test lab. We'll look a little more at it in a minute. But you can also see that there's some existing buildings down here that they're moving into, plus all of this, all these crates. People joke that this was the U.S. stockpile in February of 1946. This is a lot of it is leftover parts that were on their way to Los Alamos for the war effort that then were redirected down here. So it's all kinds of parts and pieces of things down there. No, there is no stockpile at this point, no nuclear stockpile at this point. And so all of this area is going to get built up, but this is their start on it. And you can see still the little aircraft out, well, they're not little aircraft, they just look small in the picture, the aircraft out on the edges of the site. So this was one of the first facilities built specifically to support Z Division technical activities. It's building 828, a mechanical test lab. It was designed and built specifically for testing weapon components and prototypes. The idea was to obtain statistical data on the performance of individual components. It included a vibration test capability. All temperatures and pressure components might meet. A large altitude chamber that could test a complete bomb assembly as far as pressure, temperature, and humidity were concerned. It came online in August of 1946, and I mention it in particular because it's a precursor to later test facilities developed at Sandia beginning in the 1950s. These were huge test facilities. It's sort of the environmental testing taken large. All of industry has centrifuges and impact capability to test their products in the environments they're likely to encounter. Sandias are just larger because their product is extraordinarily large, especially early on. They're going to simulate the environments that weapons and their components are likely to encounter on their way from the stockpile to their target. They also developed extensive data capture capabilities. And just on the right side of the slide, I'll note that in this building, 828, lasted until 1999 when it was taken down, and that was Sandia's 50th anniversary year as an independent lab. And so they actually cut this hoist off, this hoist structure, the piece off of the end of the building, and turned it into a sculptural piece that you can see over on the right hand side of the slide, is in the central part of Tech Area 1. And you can see that they used the metal part that was the hoist is still there. It's on a new concrete mount. And then you can see in the back, the windows, these 3 windows that are behind the hoist on the west wall of the building, have been reproduced. They're actually reproduced in stone, and have printed on them photos of Sandians at work over the course of the first 50 years of the lab's history. So it became a 50th anniversary monument there, as an effort to basically, basically to honor and preserve their history. The building itself was in terrible shape by that point, so it was coming down. As the attempt was underway to build up the new site there in 45-46, Z Division personnel, that is all of the assembly group, was called to the Pacific to support the first post-war nuclear test at Bikini Atoll. Los Alamos learned of the proposed Operation Crossroads test series in December of 1945, and it was scheduled for May of 1946. The schedule was then slipped out to July to accommodate for getting everybody there and getting it done. And in June of 1946, the test actually went off. Or they were setting up for the test. Los Alamos provided technical direction and the test devices. Bradbury organized B Division to support the tests with Dr. Ralph A. Sawyer of the Navy as technical director, and Marshall Holloway, head of the experimental group, and Associate Division Leader Roger Warner reporting to him. So Roger Warner, who was heading Z Division at that point, is then pulled into the assembly operations for Crossroads. And Warner, he went overseas in late March of 46. Z Division became a major source of personnel for the overseas effort. The assignment of the assembly group, of course, made a serious impact on what was going on back at home in Albuquerque, although the telemetry, fusing, and firing groups all experienced significant drains of manpower to just pick up and go support this test. So this image is members of the Z Division assembly group in the Pacific. Seated in front from left are Phil Daly, Ken Roebuck, Art Machen, Ira Tiny Hamilton, and then Brian Arthur. And then in the back row, Roger Warner, who was head of Z Division until he took off for this project. Major Robert Rourke, Colonel Jack Sutherland, who's seated there. Glenn Fowler is kneeling in the cap there. Alvin Van Vessen and William O. McCord, and then Gene Eister, who's seated in the back on the right. Dale Corson served as acting Z Division leader in Warner's absence. So I'm just mentioning all of this as the sort of the amount of turmoil that's kind of going on. Not really turmoil, but just turnover, basically. As they're trying to get things set up, things are changing all around them rapidly. It's like being in a pandemic and suddenly have to work from home. Anyway. So these images are from the Baker shot of the Operation Crossroads test. There was supposed to be 3 shots in the series. They only ended up doing 2. Crossroads was focused on weapon effects, that is studying the effect of this new weapon on a naval fleet. And what you can see what they did is that they created a sort of fleet of ships out of captured German and Japanese vessels, as well as US Navy vessels that they're going to retire. And located them in the center and then out at the edges. The first drop, the Able shot, was a drop and gravity bomb drop from an aircraft, and then the Baker shot was an underwater shot. So the ship in the center of this fleet had a Fat Man type weapon device suspended from it that then was detonated, and then you can see what happens is that, of course, all the water rises up then to create the cloud, the mushroom cloud. And on the stem, you can see the shadow of one of the ships being affected by the blast there. was going to be, I think I mentioned, it was going to be 3 shots. They ended up going with just 2, the airdrop and the Baker underwater shot in July of 46. The Test Evaluation Board final report on Crossroads to Truman encouraged the continued production of atomic weapons and research and development in all fields related to atomic warfare. Part of the purpose of this test was to see if Navy could survive with an attack on this new weapon, and they decided that they could. They scrubbed down the ships and had the ones on the outer edges were then operable at the end of the effort. So there's an expressed desire for building a stockpile and to advance U.S. nuclear weapon designs and to build a stockpile. But the focus on Crossroads slowed down the testing and design efforts back in New Mexico. And then also Dale Corson, who'd taken over for Warner, decided to leave, and Will Holt was acting division leader until Warner returned. So again, just a lot of turnover at the local site, not getting a lot of traction. But if progress was uneven, it was being made. In 1946, Glenn Fowler, there you can see him, he's wearing a suit jacket there instead of his cute little cap. Glenn Fowler was involved in obtaining the use of a World War II naval test range at Salton Sea in Southern California. It's an inland sea, the Salton Sea, that's at about 200 feet below sea level. And they used Salton Sea from 1946 to 1961. Again, this is straight up drop testing, ballistics, integration with delivery system, and the lower elevation of the sea allowed the experience of a broad range of environments. By the mid-1950s, however, the area around the Salton Sea was starting to build up, a lot of recreational activities as well as flyover. It was in the flight line for aircraft coming along the southern United States towards LA. And sort of bomb dropping, even if they're inert bombs, and water skiing are not a good mix. So they went looking for another test range and ended up in Nevada and established Tonopah Test Range, which Sandia still uses. But they were in Salton Sea beginning in 46. So as the Z Division was getting on its feet, sort of, the nation was turning its attention to the peace. And I just want to emphasize here the rapid series of events underway as the federal government reorganized its national security entities and established a framework for the pursuit of nuclear weapons. There's a great conjunction of events happening at the same time in the immediate post-war period. The National Security Act of 1946 was signed by President Truman in July, shortly after the second Crossroads shot, and that created the National Military Establishment, later renamed the Department of Defense. Also created the National Security Council and the CIA, and established a civilian Secretary of Defense. The priority was given to creating a new independent Air Force, which then happened. Also, the Atomic Energy Commission was created by the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, which Truman signed on August 1st. And that was a relatively complex organization with multiple parts. There's the Atomic Energy Commission itself, which will oversee all uses of atomic energy in the United States. The Military Liaison Committee, which to provide relationship with the military, because the AEC is in fact a civilian organization after sort of a long drawn out argument in Congress, which I'm sure you cannot imagine happening. But they finally settled on a civilian entity to manage nuclear energy. But then if you're going to be building nuclear weapons, you want to have a tight relationship with the military since you need to meet their requirements for the weaponry. So the Military Liaison Committee was formed. The Congressional Joint Committee on Atomic Energy was also created to provide, both parties formed a joint committee to provide oversight of and largely oversaw as well, of course, funding and direction for the AEC. And then the General Advisory Committee, which was a committee of scientists, elite scientists, to advise the Atomic Energy Commission. On December 31st of 1946, Truman signed an executive order ending the Manhattan Project and transferring control over the U.S. Atomic Energy Program to the Atomic Energy Commission, or the AEC. The facilities the AEC inherited And the ones that would be added in the following years were what is known as GOCO facilities, government-owned, contractor-operated. This is a way of organizing things that had been set up during World War II, specifically to handle the large amount of government work that was going on, government-funded science and technology that was going on, without making everybody involved a civil servant, right? Or drafting them into the military. So in the case of, for example, for Los Alamos, lots of civilians working there, mostly civilians working there, but within the Manhattan Engineer District of the Corps of Engineers. So under the auspices of the Army, but lots of civilians populating the place. And so what ends up happening is that places like Los Alamos, what is now Los Alamos National Lab, Sandia National Labs, Lawrence Livermore, all of them are they're government-owned institutions, but the people who work there are not government employees. They work for a contracting organization, so they're managed and operated by some contractor entity. Not just any old contractor entity, of course. They get the contracts and bid on them. On January 1st, 1947, the properties and personnel of the Manhattan Project transferred to the AEC. This meant that Z Division, as part of Los Alamos, was transferred to AEC control, as was the land it was on, and all of its facilities and equipment. But Sandia Base itself was not transferred to the Atomic Energy Commission. It remained military. It was a U.S. Army base. And so the commission agreed that control of the base, the physical properties that constitute the base, and the civilian and military personnel employed there in military operations would not be affected by the provisions of the executive order. So, so what you end up with is Atomic Energy Commission land in the tech areas within the base, surrounded completely by military land. And that's basically the configuration that remains today. The Department of Energy has 5 tech areas within Kirtland Air Force Base that are DOE land, and then the rest is DOD land. It's the Air Force land. It all belongs to the federal government, so it's sort of a hair-splitting exercise. And then, as I mentioned, in 1971, Sandia Base merged into Kirtland Air Force Base, so it's all just one big base now. But I think it's important to realize that in the 2 years immediately following World War II, there was no clear U.S. policy on the development or strategic planning for the use of nuclear weapons. There was no stockpile to speak of at this point. The AEC commissioners visited Los Alamos and Z Division in November of 1946 before they took over control of the Manhattan District resources. David Lilienthal, the first chair of the AEC, reported on his visit that, this is a quote, "The result was a shock. The substantial stockpile of atom bombs we and the top military assumed was there in readiness did not exist. Furthermore, the production facilities that might enable us to produce quantities of atomic weapons and weapons so engineered that they would not continue to require a PhD in physics to handle them in the field, likewise did not exist. No quantity production of these weapons was possible under the existing handicraft setup." As though underlining the issues, in November of 1946, Roger Warner left to become director of engineering for the AEC, and Robert Henderson, who you see there on the left, agreed to assume leadership temporarily. By February of 1947, he had moved the last of Z Division down to the Sandia site. That was the engineering group of which he was the leader. The United States was forming policy in response to world events as Cold War tensions increased. In March of 47, Truman called for emergency measures to bolster Greece and Turkey against communist subversion. In May of 47, the Soviet Union ordered inspection of all military trains moving from West Germany to Berlin. A policy of containment on the part of the US to contain communism was articulated in 1947. And in 1948, the Soviet Union blockade of Berlin further focused policy planners on readiness to act and to use these weapons. This included increasing pressure for a war reserve stockpile of nuclear weapons. The AEC planned to expand the production capabilities of the nuclear weapons complex, including the addition of new facilities for manufacturing and assembling. They were expressing a concern over production rates, as they had been in the Lilienthal quote and beyond, producing about 1 bomb every 2 months in mid-1947. Okay, so this was not seen, if you're going to try to ramp up and have a war reserve stockpile, that's not seen as a fast enough production. And While Henderson remained temporary director of Z Division, Bradbury and the AEC looked for a permanent leader. They felt that they needed a man of considerable prestige to provide the necessary strong leadership, someone with a broad engineering background. And in December 1947, Paul Larson arrived to serve as director. Larson was from the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins. He'd worked on the proximity fuse project during the war. And at Z Division, he launched several successful campaigns, including a major building program and increases in personnel and funding. Excuse me, and improved cooperation with the military by acting on a suggestion made by AEC General Manager to establish a joint research and development board with 3 civilians from Z Division and 3 officers from the military to help with the overall design and the move forward and the implementation of military requirements. By the time he left, unlike with most of his predecessors, there was a smooth, acknowledged, planned transition, including a farewell ceremony, which you're seeing there on the bottom right, attended by Sandia Base Commander General Robert Montague, Rear Admiral William S. Parsons, Paul Larson himself, and George Craker, who's manager of the AEC Santa Fe Operations Office. And I'm not mentioning this like, oh, they had this terrific party, this farewell party or something, but really that just to emphasize that this is the idea of a smooth transition, that you know you've got an institution when your leadership can come and go in a smooth and acknowledged fashion without it just being these assignments that are happening so rapidly. And so it's all looking more stable there by 1947, but there's a considerable pressure. And 1948 ends up being a turning point for Z Division and for the nuclear weapons complex as a whole in terms of finally gaining sufficient traction to show progress in terms of new weapon design and production. Early in 1948, Z Division began a $25 million construction program to build permanent facilities. You're looking at the Sandia base map here, and off here to the right of the parade ground here, north is to our left on this map. So north, so south of the parade ground is the AEC technical area. That's the Tech Area 1. It's going to grow to include pretty much everything to the basically to the south of the parade ground here and to the north of Main Street. Main Street is here, and that's Wyoming, what we know as Wyoming. Okay, so it's going to take this whole sort of the top right corner of this map will become Sandia's Tech Area 1. All right, but they're so they're building up there with their build construction program. And one of the first of the permanent buildings to go in is building 804. It went in the fall of 48. It's completed construction. And you can see the effect I mentioned here on the slide that this is a Max Flatow design. So they were using local architects to develop some of their facilities. This was going to be the military liaison building. It's currently now, it's still there at the lab, and it's currently contains the tech library and other functions in there. But you can see this lovely mid-century design that Flatow's firm provided. And then this is building 800 in Tech Area, also in Tech Area 1. This is part of that, comes out of that construction program, and it's here you can see it under construction in the top left, and on the bottom right, the building itself, again with this nice sort of this mid-century international style design with the long low rows of windows, this beautiful entryway with this cut back awning support out here, this sort of Cadillac fin kind of look out there. This was going to be their main, the main entrance to the lab and it was for decades. Here it included the lab director's office and things like that have since moved, but it still is an one major entry point, in part because there's a very large parking lot in front of it. And parking, as is everywhere, is always at a premium. All right, and building 800 opened around the same time as 804, and it housed the main administrative and leadership functions. And it was designed by W.C. Kruger's firm. Kruger was a noted New Mexico architect who did a lot of work for the Atomic Energy Commission, both up at Los Alamos and here at Z Division, and then later when it becomes Sandia. Sandia also, or Z Division also had the assignment for assembly activities, and this is an early assembly design by, again, W.C. Kruger's firm. And this was one of two mirrored buildings that were built to the south of the main tech area out, and we're now out into the Oxnard airfield space in what is cleverly called Tech Area 2. And the parts would enter the, in this case, the north end of the building on the left there, and would move through a series of bays to be assembled together, and then would emerge out the high bay here on the right as early on they're Fat Man type designs, right? So very large um, uh, nuclear weapons. They did not have their physics package, their core in them. All right, they didn't hold the blinding white flash, but they had all of the other components were assembled here and then shipped out. By the time these buildings opened in the fall of 1948, the Atomic Energy Commission knew that it was going to move its assembly activities elsewhere because the pressure to increase the size of the nuclear stockpile was pushing very much for the construction of additional facilities to support the activities. And so as Z Division grew, as Los Alamos itself grew, part of their functions were being handed off to other activities. So they've already, by the time this building is open for and assembling nuclear weapons, the Burlington site in Ohio has already been selected for nuclear weapons assembly, and Pantex will be selected shortly after as another site for nuclear weapons assembly and eventually disassembly activities. And so what they're basically taking is all of the activities that had been so condensed in this intense World War II effort at Los Alamos, right, crammed into that into the spaces there on the hill, are now being picked up and sent out to other locations. So the assembly activities are moving out. Some of the component design, even the manufacturing of various parts, being sent out all over the country to different places, so that the nuclear weapons complex is growing very rapidly in order to speed up that production to meet that demand of the late 1940s. But Sandia did serve as the primary assembly site for the nuclear weapons from 1948 to 1952 and retained the capability until 1957, by then focusing primarily on prototypes and training units and inert samples. And this actually ended up being a historic district where this assembly activity had gone on because this was the primary site for nuclear weapons assembly in that early period. It has, of course, all been torn down. But I just want to mention, I'm sort of really emphasizing the rate of growth because that is the real story in the early period from about 47 to about 1960. We see this rapid growth of Z Division, what becomes Sandia, of all of the different sites. Los Alamos itself is growing, and the nuclear weapons complex itself is also growing until by 1958, it basically reaches its peak in terms of number of facilities. And shortly after that, it's going to hit a production rate of about 7,000 weapons a month, as opposed to the one every 2 months that we're seeing in the late 1940s. And so they are going to achieve this assignment, which is to grow and produce nuclear weapons, give the United States a nuclear weapons stockpile. That stockpile is going to reach its peak in 1967 with over 30,000 weapons in it at that point. And of course, in the meantime, things are coming into the stockpile, but things are also going out. They're being replaced. But the point is just this rapid growth. By April 1st of 1948, Z Division and Los Alamos itself had both grown by mid-48 to about 1,000 employees, over 1,000 employees at Los Alamos, up from about 100 at Z Division in 1945. And you'll see that growth is going to continue over the years. So in 48, Z Division is declared a separate branch of Los Alamos. Okay, so it's no longer a division within Los Alamos. It's now Sandia Laboratory, a branch of Los Alamos. So because it's gotten so big. And in 48, Bradbury was expressing concerns over his ability to handle effectively the Sandia responsibilities. Much of this concern, he said, comes from administrative responsibility and the strong feeling that I actually contribute very little to the technical direction of the Sandia activities. I think that's a little bit of an understatement. But this comes from my preoccupation with Los Alamos problems, our geographic separation from Sandia, and from our lack of appropriate engineering background. In other words, it sent all the engineers off to be in a separate group, and so now they don't have anybody to manage the engineers. And at the same time, the University of California was having some qualms about being involved in ordnance activities and assembling nuclear weapons, and as well as the growth of Z Division. So because the focal point of the lab at that point, that still in 48, remained on production. And the University of California, which managed Los Alamos, of course, could see why it was managing a bunch of physicists. It understood physicists, it felt, and knew how to manage them, but perhaps not so much engineers who were actually building nuclear weapons. So push for growth. And then this is the stockpile growth to 1960. This is just what I just told you. Basically, this rapid growth, we go from a couple weapons here in 45 to none, and then we start to slowly build back up. But then once the nuclear weapons complex really gets rolling, you see this vast increase. So we're over 20,000 nuclear weapons in the stockpile by 1961. So it was meant to produce, and it did. But as I said, there's still some discontent about keeping Sandia as part of Los Alamos, just given the size. So in March and April of 1948, Mervyn Kelly, who was executive vice president of Bell Labs, was asked by the Atomic Energy Commission to conduct a study of the state of affairs at the two labs and evaluate the feasibility of placing Sandia under industrial management. He and his group concluded in their study that Sandia could be more effectively operated as a production type organization under industrial management. Okay, this is the same time they know they're going to get out of the assembly business, but they're still going to be overseeing production. And they state a preference they make a recommendation that AT&T perhaps should take on this assignment. So, and at that time, we're talking about the Bell system, okay? So there's AT&T itself, there's Western Electric, which is the engineering piece, the people who make all the phone lines, or who make all the phones and establish the phone lines, and Bell Labs, which is the research arm of the Bell system at the time. And so in May of 1949, you see there a letter from President Truman to Leroy Wilson, who was the president of AT&T, telling him that some people are going to show up from the Atomic Energy Commission and they're going to visit with you, and they're going to ask that Bell Telephone Labs consider and accept a contract to direct the Sandia Laboratory in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so he's encouraging him to be open-minded here. And then in the third paragraph, he says, I hope that after you have heard more in detail from the Atomic Energy Commission, your organization will find it possible to undertake this task. In my opinion, you have here an opportunity to render an exceptional service in the national interest. And that phrase, exceptional service in the national interest, over time becomes Sandia's motto, right? If you receive a letter, a correspondence from Sandia on actual physical paper, it will say exceptional service in the national interest along the bottom. It's basically the lab's motto, and it's taken from this letter. And Wilson initially was not all that interested, right? At the head of AT&T, he wasn't in the defense business. His AT&T was not in the defense business. They're making money off telephones and communications. He doesn't really want to really be in the defense business, and he's seen other parts of industry be accused of, taking blood money for being in the defense business. So he would like to demur, but they come back, they ask again. He's got this letter from President Truman asking him to consider it. He finally agrees and indicates that the manufacturing subsidiary of the Bell system, Western Electric, would accept the management role, because he's being told this is an engineering operation. They're the engineering and production, and they are the engineering and production arm of the Bell system. So they take it. But he insists that it's a no profit, no fee contract. All right, he doesn't want to make any money off of this. They get all their expenses reimbursed, but they're not going to accept a fee. And that contract, a version of that contract, of course, it gets thicker and thicker over the years, remains intact basically until the early 1990s, when DOE, facing all this environmental cleanup, insists that the contracts all have some kind of fee. In other words, they have to have an incentive and something that can be taken away if the contractors don't perform according to spec, or if they leave a mess, things like that, something that they can be punished with or have taken away from them. But the contract basically is a no profit, no fee until the early 90s, when AT&T gets out of the business altogether. And so with the agreement, Sandia Corporation is formed in September of 49, and the contract is signed in October. Sandia Corporation is a wholly owned subsidiary of Western Electric initially, and then it'll be handed off to the subsequent managing contractors over time. But it's formed, and then on November 1st, 1949, it takes over management of what is then Sandia Laboratory. And there's the first Sandia Corporation president, George Landry, who comes out of Western Electric, has an engineering background, and is apparently a serious individual for his portrait, at least. Okay. And this is what Tech Area 1 looked like in 1949. We're at the opposite end of where we saw Building 800, the big brick building designed by the Kruger firm, going in. So we're at the opposite end of the tech area, and looking in, and you can see that still very military in its look, a lot of military kind of construction. The building on the bottom left here on the left side is under construction and being finished up there. But you can see there's a huge emphasis on security. There's fences around everything, and there's these towers that are scattered throughout not scattered, but lined up throughout the tech areas to provide security surveillance. And the MPs, basically the military, provides security for Sandia until Korea, when they're called up to active service or to sent overseas. And so then Sandia takes over its own security at that point. But this is basically what it looked like. It's still a little military looking, a little crowded, a little rough kind of looking environment at this point. But that's what Western Electric, or Sandia Corporation, took over management of. So the presence and rapid expansion of Z Division, and subsequently Sandia, had a notable impact on the local community. This is a postcard from the 1940s from the Albuquerque Museum from downtown. You can see that the traffic looks exactly like it looks now downtown Albuquerque there. And there's the chemo theater there. Albuquerque experienced a housing and employment boom in the immediate post-war period. Sandia was not the only entity expanding within the state after the war, but its growth did have a significant impact on Albuquerque. By the early 1950s, Sandia Corporation was the largest employer in the state, not just in Albuquerque. And to a large degree, growth was encouraged. There was very strong boosterism on the part of the civic leaders and the New Mexico congressional delegation in the 1940s and 1950s, big push for growth. And they really started to position New Mexico and see it as a strong supporter of U.S. defense policy and activities, and a place to locate those activities, right? That this is a place where you should bring your defense activities because they will be welcome here and welcome the expansion. So it's part of the U.S. Western history story, right? That what happens in the U.S. West, where defense money comes in after the war and expands things. New Mexico doesn't look quite the same as Southern California or Northern Washington, and the aircraft industry, but it does get a boom out of this. The influx of people into the area drove the need for housing and a consequent push for construction. Rent control continued after the war in response to the housing shortage. And in 1947, the city established a building department to help it cope with record level construction to accommodate new residents. And still there was a housing shortage. So this is just, this chart is just a little, it's a little spacey because I want to emphasize the softness of the numbers, because it depends how and when you count things and are they really comparable. But the point is just that the growth had an impact in all areas of city life, right? You see Albuquerque growing there. between just over 35,000 in 1940, over 200,000 by 1960. Bernalillo County, as a result, also growing. And the Sandia workforce, you see they're growing from 46 to 57. And the base workforce you see over there on the right. In other words, Sandia is not the only thing on the base that's growing, or on what we just refer to it as the base, but on Kirtland Air Force Base that is growing. But public school student population increased from just over 22,000 in 1949 to 25,000 in 1950 to more than 30,000 in 1953. So there's pressure there to get more schools built, get more space in schools. The UNM student body increased from fewer than 2,000 in 1940 to over 4,600 in 1950. Sandia was actively recruiting from UNM and bringing on student interns, training them while they're in school with the thought of hiring them once they had their degrees. Sandia still basically pursues that philosophy. In terms of utilities, water connections nearly tripled from 1940 to 1950, and gas hookups nearly quadrupled. In 1950, unemployment in Albuquerque was only about 4%, which is, generally considered a pretty low number for unemployment. Personal income increased nearly 600% from 1940 to 1950, and again from 50 to 55. The combined payrolls for Kirtland Air Force Base and Sandia totaled nearly 17 million by 1950, and by 1955 that had nearly tripled. All right, so just to emphasize the amount of growth. And there's a huge multiplier effect in both payroll and purchasing dollars hitting the local economy. Support businesses expanded, and in the case of R&D for defense contractors came to the city as well. So just this huge growth. I'm just telling you about growth. And there's the housing permit increase in terms of dollars over time, just to get, again, just underlining the growth. And obviously it was a period of great opportunity for builders in Albuquerque. The housing permit numbers there indicate that, and the ad appealing directly to Sandia employees. All right, there in this from Crescent Realtor, there's no closing costs, only $41. But Sandia employees knock the high cost out of renting and transportation costs. You can live down close into the base, even as things start to build up. As all that area that we saw as not populated by people in that early shot, right, when we were looking north out over Sandia base to the north, all of that is starting to fill in. Okay, and it's just going to keep growing. It's just going to keep booming. And a 1950 article in the Saturday Evening Post couldn't express enough hyperbole over Albuquerque's amazing growth, saying new houses go up in batches of 50 to 300 at a time and transform barren mesas before you get back from lunch. So probably that was a stretch, but housing construction was pretty much a runaway train in the area at the time. So Albuquerque kept growing, ultimately up and around Sandia, so that the lab is no longer the biggest employer or biggest force in town. It's now part of what it helped to create. But what do we know now that we didn't know when you were out in the waiting room waiting for this to enter the theater here? Sandia National Laboratories' origins lie in the end of World War II and the circumstances of Los Alamos' location, the planning of its leadership, and the shifting post-war realities of technological capability and U.S. Cold War policy. World War II was different than other wars in that at the end, the science and technology devoted to the government effort did not go away. It continued and was expanded, even during demobilization and the urge to return to a peacetime footing. And that proved transformative in supporting U.S. policy and enabling it, in creating new institutions, and in altering local communities. Sandia's origin story is one of creating something with a specific intent, Z Division, to get weapon production on a steady footing, which then, in the context of immediate post-war circumstances, grew, evolved, and rapidly became something bigger and different than originally envisioned. Sandia is a piece of several larger stories, of course, as well as a piece of a large complex of national security institutions that were dreamed up and created in a very short period of time. But its roots go back to Los Alamos and the very end of World War II. I want to thank you for your time and your attention tonight. And if
Thank you, Rebecca.
you want to have questions.
Wonderful. It's fun to see all the connections, and there's a couple questions. Let me find it.
Okay.
There's a question here. Let me find it. Did the Ohio Burlington assembly site go by another name? Any other
The
names?
Burlington, Ohio. No, it had actually been an assembly. It had been a non-nuclear weapons assembly site, ordnance manufacturing during World War II for the military, and so was just turned over to become the Burlington site. There are additional assembly sites within the nuclear complex over the years, but Burlington runs for decades, and Pantex, of course, is the one that remains in place now. But I don't think it had another name. The short answer to your question.
If anyone has a question, you can go down to the little chat button and type one in, and I will relay the information to Rebecca. People are saying it's interesting to put Sandia and the base into perspective for the city and the county, and says thank you for the help over the course of many years on multiple historical and obscure research questions that neither of us could have answered on our own. The years of collaboration between the labs continued well into the 21st century.
Yeah, the labs, I mean, their missions are totally intertwined, and so they keep on keeping together, keep on working together.
Any other questions? Any questions, Gordon? Okay. Any literature you could recommend on a history of Sandia or other labs?
There are some, there's a, it's an out of print book now, but I think it's available electronically. If you were to go to the sandia.gov website under About, where history is always tucked, right, is under About. There's a history page there, and if you scroll down to the bottom of that page, there's a link to all of the various publications that have come out of the lab. So these are all the lab's telling of its own story. But there's Nisha Furman wrote a one-volume, history of the lab's first decade, so taking it up to the mid 1950s. And then Leland Johnson wrote a one-volume history of the whole lab through the late 1990s that is also available there. They're available physically. Well, I was going to recommend the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History's store carries Leland Johnson's book, but they're also there electronically, so you can get them. And then there's other publications on things like Sandia and the waste isolation pilot plant, and Sandia's pulse power, history of Sandia's pulse power organization and activities, the research there. So there's a variety of different publications there about the lab. It doesn't turn up much in the other big histories of the history of the national labs, because it's not seen as one of the sort of the root players in the national lab world.
So Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory at that time was hiring New Mexicans, but also bringing in many employees from across the country. And we saw in a lecture earlier, maybe it was pre-pandemic, advertisements from around the country. Do you know where Sandia was hiring people from?
Sandia was doing the same thing. It was hiring locally as much as it could, and as I mentioned, recruiting, of course, from UNM, and then a little later, from when New Mexico Tech is up and running, it'll recruit heavily from there as well as bringing people from all over the country as well. So it's sort of that same combination of it'll hire locally and brings people in, and both. And that's where part of the pressure on the city comes from, right? Is that there are people coming in from outside, again, not just for Sandia, but in part for that too. And then you have to house them and, give them grocery stores and things like that to work in. And so a lot of pressure there.
While not part of Sandia proper, can you talk about the development and operation of Site Abel Manzano Base, one of the AEC's 6 original stockpile sites?
So nuclear weapons storage is really a DoD question. So I'm going to refer you to the Department of Defense for any kinds of questions about stockpile storage and management, because it sits in their arena. So,
I can't really read this.
and I think that Kirtland actually has on their history page a little piece on that. But
yeah, some people are saying they grew up in Los Alamos in the 60s and 70s and never really knew about Sandia Laboratory.
no, very well hidden. There's a, I think it was Popular Science that did an article in the late 60s about Sandia called Super Lab That Nobody Knows. Sandia flew under the radar for a really long time. I mean, it doesn't anymore because it's got different mission space and is out there actively recruiting and things like that. But for a long time, it recruited, and people talk about the recruiters who went out on recruiting missions in the 1960s and 1970s to college campuses. Talk about how when they went out, they were under the AT&T umbrella, the Bell Labs and the Bell Labs AT&T, the Bell System space for recruiting. So nobody yelled at them or threw things at them or anything. They just sort of flew right under the radar there in terms of what they're. I mean, of course, obviously, when they're talking to students about the kind of engineering they were doing, and their recruiting was, I mean, their print ads. I don't have any samples available right now, but you know, their print ads made clear that they were in the nuclear weapons business, but at the same time, just in terms of flowing through the space, they were not targeted in the same kind of way or seen in the same kind of way as the other labs.
Yeah.
So for that. So yeah, I think, yeah, you could have easily been in Los Alamos and never have heard of Sandia down here.
Well, thank you so much for your time
you.
tonight, for sharing with us about the history of Sandia.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I
Come and
appreciate it.
visit one of these days and we can travel again.
Yes.
Come up and
I want to
visit.
go see the Oppenheimer house now.
Absolutely, you've got to come.
It's so exciting because I've seen the rest of the museum and the houses, but that is very exciting that you guys have got that now.
Oh, Hetty. Oh, can you discuss Sandia's role in testing nuclear weapons at the Nevada test site?
Yeah, Sandia's provided a supporting role for all of U.S. nuclear testing. And they have testing ended in 92, but they were generally responsible for the arming, fusing, and firing. So setting up the weapon, hooking it up, and then a lot of data capture. They did a great deal of work on establishing on calculations of yield in a very quick sense, right after the test, for both atmospheric and then underground, and developed a huge seismic capability. And around the Nevada test site, there is the seismic net to capture the data from underground testing. So they were heavily involved in that, always had a whole team on that, established what was referred to as a Leo Brady seismic net. And when one of the people actually on that early work, I'll just mention, is Doris Tendall, who was one of the few women scientists who were actually involved in the nuclear testing work from Sandia at the site, and worked on the seismic detection and capability. That work in turn then feeds into the nuclear detection, so they get involved in, as Los Alamos also does, in nuclear detection for satellites, and the Unmanned Seismic Observatory for detecting other people's nuclear tests, which then becomes part of the treaty monitoring technology. So they just keep unrolling more of it over time.
So Hetty is always the historian here, always. Hetty Dunn. And she says, Al Van Vessel became president of our historical society. Is there any chance you'd be willing to take a photo that includes him at Crossroads?
Sure, I will. I can get it to Liz or to Amy, and I will send it through our media relations person, because they'll want to know that we're giving it out. But yes,
that's an interesting fact, though.
that is an interesting. Yeah, that is. Yeah.
All right. I think that's about all the questions I see.
Okay.
Everyone says, awesome, great job. Thank
Oh,
you
thank
so
you.
much for sharing with us. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Our next lecture will be with Sean Levy, and it'll be on prohibition, and it should be a very light topic, so it should be it should be interesting and fun. And thank you for the people who donated to make this possible, to keep us up and running, and who have made donations to the Oppenheimer House Fund. There is a separate bank account and fund set up for the Oppenheimer House if anyone is interested in donating specifically to that cause. It is going to take a significant amount of work, but we are up to the task and we're going to make it happen. So we appreciate your support. Thank you, everyone.